deep dive into the world of psychedelics, hosted by Ben Brooker. You're with Friends in High Places.
Well, hello, Caine Barlow, and welcome to Friends in High Places.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, it's great that you happen to be in Adelaide at this time, because you were definitely one of the first people that I thought of having on when I started kind of conceptualizing this podcast about all things psychedelic. And you're on Instagram as Guerrilla Mycology, so that's kind of where you're coming from, that's your background. So I kind of wanted to really start by asking you, I guess, about your kind of origin story, or your kind of foundational interest in mushrooms and psychedelic mushrooms, and also altered states of consciousness, because when we spoke for the first time a few months ago now, you answered this question sort of by saying that your interest in mushrooms and psychedelics was entangled from the start, I think you said. So
pretty much.
Yeah, so did you want to say something?
Entangled. I was quite fortunate in that I grew up in a rather alternative kind of environment. I lived very close to nature. My parents had a kind of alternative mindset. Isolated, not surrounded by the kind of 9 to 5 thing that a lot of people do. So I grew up with the option to kind of be able to think openly about the world, nature, but then also consciousness. And so my parents were happy for me to, I think, explore ideas a little bit as well. So with science, for example. So I grew up with Omni magazine. I don't know if you ever read Omni magazine. It was a really lovely sci-fi kind of science magazine. Okay. And there was lots of stuff about consciousness. Like, what is consciousness? And how is it generated by the brain? So for me, there was kind of a lot of thought about that. And I had a numerous ecodelic kind of experience as well. Slightly mystical, I guess, by virtue of being close to nature and being able to just go out and sit amongst the trees and just experience it. Incredible. And then at a certain point, I came across Don Juan, the teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, and talking about his experiences of going out to the desert and meeting this character, who we now know is fictional, unfortunately, and that was a bit of a disappointment when I learned about that. But in that first book of that incredible series, he goes into numerous plants. And I guess for me, that was the introduction to ethnobotany. So psilocybe mexicana, for example, but also mentions peyote, Phophora williamsii, and datura, which I already kind of had a bit of a relationship with datura because I love brigmansias. Right. So I kind of grew up with them. One of my favourite flowers. But it was great to read that book because it was just kind of like, oh, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to go there. But the mushrooms, it was like, okay. And because growing up in the forest, it's like you see them. They're these kind of mystical little creatures that kind of are hidden in the undergrowth, and you don't know a lot about them. You don't learn a lot about them. And other than going out with my grandparents and my parents foraging mushrooms, I didn't really know much more about them. So it kind of triggered that interest in what is fungi on one hand, but then also what is this amazing experience that they generate on the other hand. Right.
So I think you told me as well that you must have had a thought at some point whether or not you were going to kind of pursue this academically or at a sort of career level. In the end, I think you didn't decide to do that, and like me, took a Bachelor of Arts instead. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So does that feel like a bit of a sliding doors moment for you, or?
I guess, yeah, because I continued that research that I was, like investigating mushrooms, and I kind of had these synchronous kind of experiences with coming across psychedelic themed books in the library. So there's this beautiful series on all kinds of psychoactive compounds, and there was a few of those in my local library, and just kind of happened to cross it, the magic mushroom one, and when I discussed people like Watson and Schultes and Hoffman and all this other stuff, and then not far along from that was also the psychedelic experience by Leary, Metzner, and Albert, and I dived into that as well, and I guess, and I was kind of lucky. My peers, we all shared this kind of interest in consciousness and this interest in, where can these states take you? So at a certain point, we investigated that. I was very scientifically orientated at that time, and that for me was very mind-opening. And I guess I started finding that more artistic aspect. Right.
What do you mean? What do you mean? Go on.
To the arts degree.
Right.
Yeah.
So you feel in a way that those early experiences of yours opened you up in a creative as well as scientific sense?
I was very much a philosophical materialist. It was just like, the human body is just a machine. It's just a machine or an organism or a complex combination of different organisms. Consciousness is an illusion through the sophisticated mechanisms of whatever it is. And so then psychedelics for me were very much like, hang on, there's something else here.
Right.
Like when you have that experience of oneness, of time stopping, the universe being infinite, and the incredible visual play that happens around you during the experience, I feel like it's just like, there is something far more sophisticated. Like, I don't know if that mechanistic philosophy really answers all those questions. So I guess it threw me off into, a different way of thinking. And I guess to come back to my parents, my parents were happy to kind of encourage me to read Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs and Ginsberg and, like those kind of really early pre-hippie kind of people who were also very disenfranchised with society, and there's got to be more to this.
Right.
So you had Kerouac off travelling on the road, and Burroughs and his thought experiments, and Ginsberg just reaching out to the, the spiritual spaces.
And what about John Lilly? I think that's his name. Is it John Lilly, the gentleman who created the deprivation tank and was undergoing?
Yeah, I didn't encounter John Lilly till a long time afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
It feels like a part of that kind of lineage that you just described, so I wondered if he was...
He kind of is.
Yeah.
He was definitely an offbeat character.
Very, very far out.
Yeah. When was he? He was working in late 50s and early 60s, I think.
And through into the 70s, I think.
Yeah. Centre of the Cyclone and Deprivation Tank.
Right.
And then the book Altered States was written about him.
Yeah, and there's that extraordinary film of it. You've seen it? I only watched it for the first time recently. It's absolutely wild.
It is absolutely wild.
Yeah, it's a fascinating sort of product of its time, I think.
It is.
I'm not sure it would get made now, but it's...
No, I don't think it would. It felt a little bit sensationalist.
Yes.
Kind of like, I don't know if you've read The Serpent and the Rainbow by Wade Davis.
It's sitting in my to-be-read pile at home.
It's a fantastic read.
Yeah.
But they kind of took the story for the film version and took it in a different direction.
Right.
Which I kind of feel like they did with Altered States. It's like, got a little bit more crazy than I think it was intended from the book.
Yeah. And it seems to be playing off a little bit some of that early drug war kind of paranoia and fear-mongering around, for example, like ideas that LSD could alter people's chromosomes and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. let's turn you into a crazy person. Let's
Yeah.
go right back and,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
as in the film, you know, oh, hang on, got to be careful of spoilers, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, that ending is just like, okay.
It's quite something.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back to your kind of pathway, I suppose, to where you are now. And it's interesting sort of trying to place you in a way, because a part of me wants to describe you as a citizen scientist, but that feels, it doesn't feel equal to what it is that you actually do in some ways.
I'm happy with being called a
Are
citizen
you?
scientist.
Okay.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I am. I'm very much into encouraging people to do that.
Mm-hmm.
To if you want to learn about something, if you want to read something, research something, and you can in your home environment, then why not?
Right.
You know, go buy the books or
Sure.
go scour the internet.
Right.
And I guess that was, you know, like, so you asked about my interest in mycology. So yeah, I got to uni, was doing my arts degree.
Mm-hmm.
I did come across the mycology section. You know, I was looking for, I guess, the genus psilocybe, and I found it, and it was surrounded by all these incredible mycology books, and I did have that moment of like, oh, what am I doing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I should maybe be doing mycology.
Right.
But then there was also that thing of like, yeah, but what jobs are there other than growing maybe Agaricus bisporus, which wasn't very appealing.
Right.
And I was I was very happy going down that arts path at the time.
Okay.
So, but jumping ahead 15 years, and there was a bit of a kind of sudden re-interest in mycology. So I'd been reading a lot about anthropology and ethnobotany, reading the books, but had not really done a lot of hands-on other than our foraging.
Right.
And it was just kind of like, oh, but so how, particularly from a conservation aspect, you know, because I had this beautiful patch of forest that I was foraging through, and I suddenly learned that I was going to be all chopped down.
Right.
And there were these lovely mushrooms there, and it's like, well, how can I collect these and propagate them?
Mm-hmm.
How can I keep them growing? And that was kind of what kicked me off into the looking how to cultivate. And so I started cultivation from a very citizen science background.
Right.
Of researching on the internet and just how can I do this at a very basic level, but enough to be able to cultivate mushrooms in the kitchen. So that's my background, and I really like that. I want to try to keep true to that.
Right.
Just like that, you can do mycology in the kitchen, from agar and growing mycelium through to spawn, and then through to growing the mushrooms themselves.
Yeah, a friend of mine watched our recent episode with Chris Leatherby, who's an academic and a philosophical materialist.
Yeah.
And my friend sort of put it to me that by comparison to Chris, who's a proper academic, I'm more of a free-range scholar, is how she put it. And I feel like that's actually quite a good label, perhaps, for what it is that you do.
Yeah.
And I think that's reflected actually in your Instagram handle as well, Guerrilla Mycology, that we've already mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the philosophy of guerrilla gardening, of
Right.
people just going out there and finding an empty patch of dirt, of grass, and overnight turning it into a garden. I guess, how does that work with mushrooms? I'm not sure, but at least, you know, just using random kind of kitchen things to be able to grow mushrooms feels fairly guerrilla to me.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, so you grew up in Tasmania, and you mentioned earlier that your upbringing was somewhat isolated. So I'm curious as to how did you find community? Because at the time that you were kind of discovering your interest in these things, and you were also obviously pulling together from various different traditions, you've mentioned mycology and ecology, conservation. There must have been points where you were hungry for community to connect with other people around these issues. I wonder how you went about that.
Yeah, see, I really struggled through university with having that community. I had a few peers, and we were very close, and we experimented a lot.
Right.
and it was a really nice kind of little group. It was nice and close, and so we could really dive in and talk about a lot of these kind of issues. But beyond a certain point, it's just like, how do you connect with a wider group of people? I kind of fell into the psytrance community a little bit in Tasmania.
Right.
That for me was really eye-opening. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being out in the forest with this incredible music at the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking mid-90s, so it
right.
only just really
right.
kind of hit Australia. You know, and have you heard much Simon Posford, or probably known at the time as hallucinogen?
No.
You know, but a lot of that music had all these beautiful quotes from Timothy Leary.
Mm-hmm.
Who wrote not Clockwork Orange? Who was the other one?
Aldous Huxley, maybe.
Yeah, there were some quotes from him.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we were listening to a lot of Floyd and the Doors as well. You know, and the Doors
right.
have kind of some of those quotes slip through from the older, you know, like the Beats and
right.
and their reference back to Baudelaire and Rimbaud and other people. No, but I'm thinking. It was set in an insane asylum.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah, it's Ken Kesey.
Ken Kesey.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, they're the whole kind of milieu in itself, isn't it? It's like
totally.
Ken Kesey and the Bus and that group.
Right, right.
But yeah, no, like, so Posford's song LSD has this beautiful Ken Kesey quote.
Okay.
And stuff like that.
Right.
You know, so being exposed to these kind of quotes, and it's just like, oh wow, this is fascinating. You know, and it kind of then triggered getting into the literature a little bit more and finding other books and things.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I guess, jumping ahead 10 years from that to then getting into the cultivation stuff. And I stumbled across this group called the Corroboree, this beautiful forum. And there was conversations then about Entheogenesis Australis. It was like, who is this group?
Mm-hmm.
And then, they're running a conference.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Right.
So
and this is we should explain it for people who don't know, it's, I guess, an ethnobotanical not-for-profit.
Ethnobotanical not-for-profit. Very much about keeping that conversation going around ethnobotanical plants and how they can be used for spiritual purposes. And exploring, I guess, the botany, the philosophy, anthropology, and very kind of mixed media kind of conversations.
Right.
So yeah, I went to the conference and bam, it was just like, oh wow, I found my tribe. You know, like just sitting around and just watching these incredible presentations and workshops. It was just like, oh, I've been looking for this for years.
And you know, it's interesting because in some senses it feels like you were maybe ahead of the curve, because this is an interesting moment, obviously, for psychedelics. People talk about the psychedelic renaissance, which is a term I have some issues with, but that's kind of the shorthand, I suppose, for this interesting era, which is about 15 years or so old now, where obviously we've got a lot of new interest in psychedelics and clinical trials happening to ascertain their utility in terms of treating mental health conditions. But sort of alongside that, but I think that has spurred in many ways a resurgence of interest in mushrooms, in mycology and in foraging. And there's this kind of new generation of Insta foragers. I think they're known as, you know, these kind of foraging kind of identities on Instagram. And I suppose you're one of them, but you were there from the beginning in some ways. So I wonder what's it like for you to be, in a way, witnessing this resurgence and being a part of it.
It's been a fascinating thing to watch. You know, like when I first started psychedelics, I guess, around about 30 years ago, you know, like we as a little group, there was this enthusiasm of like, this is amazing. Like, what is this experience? And wanting to communicate it to other people. but you kind of have to be careful because you start to sound a little bit, dare I say it, a little bit crazy in your enthusiasm.
A little bit evangelistic,
maybe. A little bit evangelistic, yeah, totally. And I think there is a little bit of that at the moment. I think there's certainly part of it in this renaissance of, oh my God, there's this experience that you can have and it brings you in touch with yourself. So, but I think it's been nicely tempered. I think it's kind of good to see that happen.
Right.
But from, I think when I first joined in with EGA in 2007, there was still at that point, it was just like, we're not going to see decriminalisation for a long, long time.
Right.
And then you skip forward to, I don't know, I think 2011, and there was suddenly something happening, 2010, 2011,
right.
which is around the time that PRISM got formed, and we had Rick Doblin come out to Australia.
Right.
And that was the point at which it was like, oh, something's happening. There is a change happening here, and there's some forward movement.
Right. And so
and
PRISM,
people are starting to take this seriously.
Yes.
At a research level.
And just to say, PRISM is another not-for-profit, one of the other major players in the psychedelic space in Australia, psychedelic research in science and medicine.
That's the one.
Headed by Martin Williams, who we've already mentioned. Yeah.
Yes. So, that kind of came out of this beautiful meeting in 2010 with Rick Doblin.
Right.
So EGA bought Rick out.
From MAPS in the US.
Yes. And started that conversation.
Right.
And PRISM formed shortly afterwards. That it's time that there was an organisation that could push that forward here in Australia.
Yeah.
And they've done a sterling job.
Right.
So it's been beautiful to watch that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, progress is slow. I think one of the things Martin Williams used to say at conferences is he used to have this shtick where he'd say, this is the state of psychedelic research in Australia, and then a blank slide would come up and, everyone would be rolling in the aisles. But of course that's changed significantly since then. But as we were kind of preparing to come on, we were having a little conversation in a way, I think, about how some of the old drug war propaganda dies hard, doesn't it? It's really still with us in many ways. And I was saying to you that I'd seen some reporting this mushroom season around poisonings, and supposedly poisonings are up through mistaken identification, which I suppose is what you'd expect if there are just more people out foraging.
Yeah.
But often the advice is this really blanket advice, which I think is really unhelpful, which is, basically never pick anything that you forage. And I think we're in fairly strong agreement that we should be educating people rather than, recommending prohibition in some ways.
Yeah, the recommendation was just only eat what you could purchase at a supermarket or from the market,
right?
For example. So, whereas, now there's been this huge increase in foraging for culinary fungi and also for the interesting fungi, the psilocybes. There's something I've noticed through because in the Facebook groups that I help to moderate in is a change in the type of people who are now asking about fungi. So,
right.
There's an increase in your general foragers. You see that in other groups, in the kind of more psychoactive fungi groups. You're starting to see a lot of older people who are like, well, I want to be able to get treatment for my PTSD, for I want to work through these issues that I've not been able to successfully get treated in any other way. So I want to try this psilocybin that everybody's talking about. It's just taken off in the last 5 years, and it's huge now. And as you just mentioned, there's suddenly a huge spate of poisonings this year. And I've seen people be a little bit haphazard in their behaviour online as well.
So what's your advice to people? Because I assume in these forums and maybe in other spaces as well, you'd have people saying, I'm interested in foraging. I don't know how to go about it. Do you have a kind of stock answer to that question these days?
My stock answer is work out the species that you want to forage for. You know, and I guess that depends where you are.
Right.
You know, like Victorian mushrooms are different to Queensland mushrooms, just by virtue of different climates.
Right.
I guess Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania kind of share groups of fungi. There is a little difference in some of the species, but yeah, my advice is just to find out the species in your area, research them, learn what they look like, and then learn about the lookalike species.
Right.
You know, what are you possibly going to misidentify them for? So, yeah.
And there are some really useful tools out there that I've found. I mean, it's interesting for me because my journey, in a sense, is quite new. I only really became interested in this subject, I think, about halfway through last year's mushroom season, which felt really disappointing because I felt like just at the moment I was getting excited about it, the season was nearly over. But it gave me a reason to look forward to winter this year. And living in the Adelaide Hills as I do, it's an incredibly kind of fecund area for mushrooms. They're literally everywhere, including in our house paddocks. Pine mushrooms particularly.
That's a fairly common story, and that's something I come across all the time.
Right.
Is people, midway through the season are like, oh, I want to find mushrooms.
Right.
It's like, oh, it's a little bit late. You might find some.
Right.
But you also have the opportunity to use the summer to then research those fungi that you're interested in. You know, whether you want to go out foraging for edibles, so like your pine mushroom,
right,
for example, or your fieldies, your agaricus species, Lepista nuda, the wood bluet, other species like that. Or if you're interested in the psychedelic ones, you have that time over summer to kind of research that and to work out, what are the lookalikes?
Yeah.
How can you best avoid not getting poisoned?
Right. You might have seen there was a record-breaking porcini mushroom that was harvested in the hills recently.
This year?
This year. Which apparently was inedible because it was kind of so large. It was 2-point-something kilos or something outrageous.
That's always the thing with fungi, is try to get the younger fungi. It's where the flavour is. Yeah, totally.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about species. Australia has various species of endemic psilocybe and other psychoactive mushrooms as well. And as you were mentioning before, it obviously varies from state to state. The more temperate states obviously has a slightly different profile to the more tropical states. Here in South Australia, if you're looking for psychedelic mushrooms, you'll probably be familiar, or will at least come across Psilocybe aeruginosa. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Right to me.
I learned my pronunciation from you, Caine, so I blame you if it's wrong.
Right.
And in the more northern tropical states, you're more likely to come across Psilocybe cubensis, which is an introduced species.
That's right. And Panaeolus sinensis, which is also an introduced species. Yes, but what other species? So we have Psilocybe semilanciata as well, which is a temperate species. So Tasmania, Victoria, and New South Wales. Right. It tends to be more alpine in Victoria and New South Wales. I don't know if it occurs in South Australia. I don't know if you have quite the right kind of hills here, or if it's possibly too dry. Okay. Yeah, I'm not aware of any records here. Right. So, but then there's also Psilocybe alitaceae, or Ludicea, and that grows off animal dung. Right. Commonly wombat dung, but it does grow off wallaby dung as well. So, South Australia, Tasmania, New South Wales. Right. And even, I think, Queensland. Yeah, people are finding them in Queensland.
Interesting. And you wrote a really, I think, excellent kind of guidebook in a way to the aeruginosa species for EGA, which I'd recommend to everyone listening and watching, without necessarily going into kind of over much detail, what do we know about this species? Because it's got a bit of a reputation as being one of the more potent
it's an incredibly potent
containing species.
Yeah, incredibly potent. It's amongst the more potent species on the planet.
Right.
So Seberogenosa and Azurescens share that kind of reputation as being the two strongest species, and they're both pretty close.
Right.
So, but I think Azurescens tips in terms of total tryptamines.
Okay.
So psilocybin, psilocin, baeocystin, norpsilocybin, erigenesin, and there's a few other compounds as well.
And there's still some uncertainty, isn't there, around the role of each of these tryptamines, because in some of the psychoactive mushrooms, you will only find psilocybin and psilocin.
Yeah.
But in other species, you'll find that whole range that you were just talking about. And I mean, there is so much in general that we don't know.
I just think it's about the kind of substrate that you're growing mushrooms on.
Right.
You know, like, so these wood-loving mushrooms have these really dense and kind of nutritious substrates, and they're just able to produce all these tryptamines. Whereas cubensis kind of, they don't produce quite as much.
Right.
I mean, when you start talking about some of the bred ones that are cultivated indoors, like penis envy, I think things start to change there, and you do start to get more of those other tryptamines.
Right.
But we were talking about Seberogenosa.
We were talking about Seberogenosa.
And it's a really fascinating species, not only because it's really potent, but also because it has this huge coverage across the continent. So it's everywhere from the far south of Tasmania, so Matsaka Island, right through now to southeast Queensland.
Right.
All through coastal New South Wales, through Victoria, into South Australia. It does occur in Western Australia, but it's introduced there. So that's probably going to be an interesting part of whatever population study does happen. But we don't know a lot about this particular species. We don't know a whole lot about Australian psilocybes in general either, because we're restricted by the fact that they contain a Schedule 9 substance.
Sure.
So, and no academics have really wanted to go in there and actually start investigating them. Because you have to go through the permitting process, you have to have all these kind of licenses for how you're going to just keep on top of or track the cultures, and they have to be locked away and, you know, double signed disposals and stuff like that, which is problematic. Let alone also, I guess, how are you going to be seen by other academics because you're meddling with the funny mushrooms,
right?
Kind of thing. So things are changing though. I mean, we're in the United States. There's a whole heap of companies now who are openly investigating psilocybe, cultivation. I guess prepping for that economic aspect that's going to happen when it does happen. But yeah, no, as a result of that, we don't know a lot.
Right.
And so to come back to Seberogenosa, we don't really know a lot about it.
Right.
It could be more than one species hidden within the one species. If you go back through the literature, at a certain point, I think it was in 92, Chang and Mills made Psilocybe australiana and Psilocybe eucalypta, synonymous with Seberogenosa.
Right.
So, but who knows? Maybe they're legit species.
Interesting. I mean, you might know the exact figure, but I'm sure I often come across a figure which is something like that we've only identified around 10%, or perhaps it's less, of global mushroom species.
Yeah, so it could be. It's in the 100 thousands, I think, species that we do know of.
Right.
I can't remember the exact figure, but it's estimated to be between 2.2 million to 3.8 million
right.
species of fungi.
Right.
That's including macrofungi and microfungi.
Mm-hmm. And there was a mycologist who spoke at one of the recent EGA conferences, who I think may be Chilean, but you might correct me on this.
Yes, she is.
Okay, good. And so she advocates for really a kind of expansion of this idea of flora and fauna that we have, as in plant life and animals. And she believes that we should be looking at this kind of, I'm sure you know this, the kind of 3F structure, including fungi in that setup, in that classification system. And to me, that sounds like a really good idea, because it feels like, the mushrooms, the fungi, are very much kind of underrepresented and underexplored and underappreciated in many ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this has been a beautiful thing, I think, of the last probably 20, but particularly the last 10 years, is this sudden boom of interest in fungi, from medicinal fungi through to their role in the environment, and particularly the awareness of, we need to actually start conserving our fungi, because we don't know a lot about them. We don't fully understand their role in the environment.
Right.
So yeah, hence this 3Fs, which Alison Coolio has also written about as well.
Right.
These 3Fs, that in conservation it's primarily flora and fauna, and we've forgotten that fungi aspect.
Yeah.
But yeah, Juliana's definitely championing that.
Do you think that has kind of much prospects for kind of getting widely taken up? What's your sense of that?
I think it is being taken up.
Okay.
I think thanks to people like Juliana, who's really doing the hard yards in terms of just getting around the planet and talking about fungi and how important they are, but also just how amazing they are. They're these incredible organisms that just do all this stuff and essentially underpin whole ecological systems.
Right.
And I think that's really only starting to drop into the mass media of, like, wow, they're actually really fundamental.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
You could probably see my enthusiasm around that.
Yeah, absolutely. There was one other species that I really wanted to ask you about, because I know it's one that you have an interest in, and I do as well, which is Amanita muscaria, often known as the fly agaric. And if people don't know those terms, they'll almost certainly recognize this species, because it's often called the most charismatic of all the mushroom species.
I think it is pretty much the most charismatic.
Yeah.
It's definitely the archetypal kind of magic mushroom.
Right.
It's associated with fairies and goblins and gnomes, and and it turns up in all these illustrated picture books and fairy tales. And,
right. And it's in the Mario video game series.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's what is it, the 1-up?
Yes, that's right.
The red one's the
power
1-up, and the green one's the 2-up.
Right.
So, so we've kind of been almost, it is in the proper, sense of the term archetypal.
Yeah.
It's there, it's this image that we have from childhood of, mysterious magic mushroom that you don't touch, you leave it alone. And that's kind of led, I think, to a lot of myths around it.
Yes. So there is a lot of mythology around it, that it has something to do with the mythology of Father Christmas, for example, and Wasson thought it was the soma. Correct. And a lot of this has kind of been more or less debunked at this point, or at least is highly speculative, shall we say?
Yeah.
But it is a mushroom that people will often encounter in the wild. I mean, again, living in the Adelaide Hills, it's literally around our house. It's it's up and down the streets that I travel every day, and of course, in that amazing bright red cap with the white warts, it's incredibly distinctive. You can't mistake it for anything else. And it's we should say that it's psychoactive, but it's not psychedelic in the way that other magic mushrooms that we've discussed are. So it doesn't contain psilocybin. Did you want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
So it contains ibotenic acid, which is the prodrug for muscimol. And even though they're kind of similar. So like if we talk about psilocybin and psilocin, so psilocybin is the prodrug for psilocin. It gets dephosphorylated within the body,
right?
And so it's the psilocybin that's active. Whereas with ibotenic acid, it is psychoactive in its own right, but it is slightly. It has been reported as being neurotoxic. So in enough doses, it can have bad side effects. So there's a method of preparation around that, which is to essentially to dry it out. And it's through that heat process that it then becomes decarboxylated to muscimol.
Right.
So, and muscimol is a GABA agonist. So it's a different effect
right.
that you have.
And in most of the guidebooks that you pick up or field guides, it's listed as a toxic species. But I believe it's actually the case that very, very few deaths have ever been known to have resulted from it. If you pick it up in the wild and eat it, it'll make you sick. But
so there's an interesting story about Amanita muscaria is that it was the compound that was first identified as being hallucinogenic. It was in the 1850s or 1860s. It was in muscarine. Right. Which is really toxic. And it does turn up in other fungi species in much, much greater amounts. But in Amanita muscaria, it's insignificant. There's not a whole lot of it at all. And so hence why it has this reputation for being really toxic, or even potentially deadly,
right?
Is because of this muscarine. But there's only another problem with fly agaric is that it's a species complex.
Right.
So there's potentially other species hidden under this kind of one name, the fly agaric.
Right.
So I think in Australia we have the European fly agarics, so they came out from Europe.
Right.
Whereas the American species are the ones that have a higher amount of the muscarine.
Right. And as you say, it is an introduced species, and it is a weed here, essentially.
Weed here. So coming back to the conservation point,
right?
Yeah, no, it is something that we need to be careful of. It's just kind of randomly picking it up and looking at it is enough to kind of disturb the spores and get it onto your body or onto your shoes. So, yeah,
right.
If you speak to some people, they're very much. You need to kind of clean your shoes and clean your clothes if you go in from fly agarics into like national parks, for example.
Right. Which
in Tasmania,
in
the Nothofagus forests in Mountfield National Park, for example, you drive into the park area at the entrance to the park, and there's this beautiful green lawn and European trees planted there with the Amanita muscaria. And then people are kind of looking at them, walking around them. They're getting spores on their shoes.
Right.
And then they're driving up into the Nothofagus forest.
Right.
And walking around. And they're just distributing the spores. And so there's now this problem where the fly agaric has jumped host and is now growing off the Nothofagus trees.
Right.
And is potentially pushing out some of the endemic fungi off their natural host.
Right, right.
So, bit of a concern there.
It is, but this is probably a good point for us to maybe say something about, I suppose, foraging etiquette, because many of the guidebooks will sort of touch on this. What are some things that you would advise people to kind of do or not do in terms of, conserving wilderness areas if people are going into them to forage?
I would recommend people to not forage in national parks.
Right.
Point blank. They're kind of there as that kind of safeguard of for plants and fungi. I know people that do, and it's problematic.
Right.
And legally, you're not meant to. You're not meant to pick anything. If you get caught by a ranger picking any kind of organic matter in a national park, you're going to get fined for it. There's also the same rules for state forest. I guess that's a little bit more open to interpretation. I mean, the law is still there. You should not be collecting off any public land at all, and you can get fined for it.
Right.
Again, people do it. So, I guess in terms of etiquette, so a lot of people will go out foraging in pine forests. So how many pine forests do you have here?
A lot. So actually, we just recorded an episode with Antonika from the Australian Psychedelic Society up at Kaipo Forest, which is a big pine plantation in the Adelaide Hills. And one of the other kind of prime foraging spots, which is sort of also up my way as well, is Mount Crawford, which is, again, it's a pine plantation. And, you know, they're incredibly popular spots for foraging, and, you know, you'll often see people in there with, you know, big baskets full of saffron milk caps and other such treasures.
Pine forests are a great way to learn how to forage because you do have those, you have the edible species, so you have like the pine mushrooms, you have the slippery jacks and numerous other species that occur there, and also the psilocybes.
Right.
They occur in the pine forest. And one of the benefits of the pine forest is that because it's kind of a manufactured forest in a sense, you know, it's all plantation, is you're not going to get a lot of the lookalikes that you're probably likely to strike in eucalypt forest,
right?
For example. So it's a good place to learn. It's a good place to kind of find those kind of common species, get and become familiar with them. So, and I guess to come back to the etiquette that you're asking about is you go in there and you only take what you want, what you can use. You know, don't hit the forest and take everything that you see. You know, you can only eat so many pine mushrooms.
Right.
Although it's nice to take a bunch extra for maybe drying out and pickling, for example. There's lots of different rules. So, you know, like take half of the mushrooms within a particular area, for example, half to 75%, and leave some for other people. Then there's kind of like the cut versus the pull conversation as well. In some parts of the world, it's the recommended thing is to cut the mushroom. Other people will suggest, and this is what I suggest as well, is just to hold the mushroom at the base and just gently remove it. Don't disturb the mycelium too much.
Okay.
The thing with the psilocybes is when you pull them, you know, the mycelium is attached to so many other chips and bits. You can pull out huge chunks. So hence why I recommend just holding it and removing it.
Right.
It can start lots of arguments, but people have done research on that, and it's generally kind of mixed. There's no huge difference between the two, but if anything, pulling kind of is slightly better.
Okay. You see, I've been told differently, and this is one of the reasons that I invested in a really lovely Opinel mushroom knife. I don't know if you've seen them, but they come with a brush, and they're really kind of beautiful objects. But I was told that you should kind of cut them off at the cap and take the cap and leave the stipe behind.
Yes.
But sounds like you're saying something different.
I think in some cases, I think particularly like with those beautiful boletes, you know, like the Boletus edulis.
Yes.
You know, it is. I think it's just nicer just to cut it at the base, because otherwise you really have to kind of dig in there and pull it out. Right. So, yeah.
So you're.
I would definitely probably do that.
Do that. Yeah.
In that particular case.
Sure.
With the pine mushroom, for example, I probably wouldn't cut it at the base. I would just probably do the same. I would just hold it and pull it up.
So the reason that you're in Adelaide is you're doing a few mushroom cultivation workshops for APS.
I am.
Which is great, and that's something that you're kind of doing more and more of. And again, I think that's for me a part of this kind of citizen science movement that we've already discussed. But I guess in terms of your own kind of personal interest in this subject, I sort of wanted to maybe finish up by asking you, what else are you keen to explore in terms of mushrooms and mycology? Where are you going? Is there a master plan, or do you kind of move from kind of, bespoke area of interest to the next one? How does it work for you, and where is your mind at the moment with these questions?
I think my master plan is fungi education. Mm-hmm. So I refer to myself as a mycologist and a fungi educator.
Right.
I really love communicating knowledge about fungi to people. Mm-hmm. And I'm also very passionate about the democratization of knowledge. That growing mushrooms is it's not a trivial process, but it's generally an easy process. And it's something that you can do at home, and it gives you, a certain sense of accomplishment of being able to grow your own food, grow your own medicines, but also from the perspective of conservation. I'm very passionate about conservation of fungi and encouraging people, if you can grow your own mushroom, then you don't have to go out to the forest to harvest wild specimens. You can culture from the wild and then grow at home. And grow it the way you want it. If you want it to be really organic, in a permaculture setting, which I definitely recommend. I'm very big on permaculture.
Right.
That you can do it in that way, or just however you choose. If you just want to grow it on logs in the garden, for example, or other methods. So my path forward is just continuing with communicating how to grow your own mushrooms, communicating conservation, and I guess also with the psychedelic stuff, how to just developing an appreciation for the species that are present and how to be safe and how to be sensible, with an awareness of these beautiful organisms and appreciate them.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on, Caine. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to chat about all things mushrooms right in the middle of what feels like a really great mushroom season here in Adelaide. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me.
Created on the land of the Kaurna people. Technical production by Edmund Kemp Attrell. Supported by Replay Creative. Music by Lazy Susan.